I'm Steve Hers. I'm the coordinator of this event. The program is co-sponsored by Broome County Farm Bureau, the Joint Landowners Coalition, and Broome County Cooperative Extension. And I want to thank everybody that helped put this together. The folks that organized this seminar felt that the state, the administration mandates to utilize solar energy to help meet the state's energy production. Landowners need a better understanding of what these mandates mean. We want to be clear that this is not a pro-solar or an anti-solar discussion. It is simply education. We're trying to educate mostly, frankly, our landowner constituents.
I've actually been doing environmental studies for a long time, and Steve asked me to speak here on a thing. And what we're talking about specifically are solar farms. Now, when we talk about solar farms, we're talking about large arrays. And coincidentally, what I have the picture up on the screen behind me is the solar farm at Cornell University, because we happen to be in the Cornell Cooperative Extension. It's actually a pretty nice facility up there that I visited, and I've gone up with Jim Leonard, one of our speakers here. And if you look at the picture on the thing, a couple of things are kind of interesting about it. It's around 10 acres, and in the middle of the solar farm are a couple of areas that are still covered with vegetation. Those are little wetlands. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is we know that wetlands are important and everything, but from my experience and the things that I know, a wetland that's in the middle of a solar farm isn't quite as valuable as a wetland that creatures have access to, especially since this wetland is actually surrounded by a high fence that you can't get in and out of it. So this isn't quite as good. It's a nice solar farm. I'm going to move on just a little bit here. Let's see. Let's go. I can do it this way. I know that. All right, one of the things that happened on the 25th of January of this year, the Public Service Commission staff was asked to prepare a white paper on clean energy standards, and the governor actually directed the Department of Public Service to develop clean energy standards.
Can't hear you.
I guess I almost have to swallow this microphone because I'm actually hitting it with my tongue. So. I think this might be better. He turned it up a little bit. Anyway, what the governor asked is the Department of Public Service staff to come up with standards that convert targets to mandated requirements. This is kind of an interesting document. It's very long and it's interesting, and I would recommend that if you can, you try to read it, because, and they're asking for comments on this too, and their comments are going to be dealt with in another meeting in June where they're actually going to come out with mandated requirements. But this will be backwards this way. One of the things that I prepared, this is just a list of all the acronyms that are in the thing, and I didn't know how many people were here, but I actually prepared with like 25 or 30 copies of this, and if someone actually wants to read this thing afterwards, they're going to sit down and do it, I'll give you one of these copies afterwards, because you get into the thing and there'll be 4 or 5 of these things in each sentence, and if you don't know what they mean, it just takes you forever to go through it. But if anybody wants one of those, I'd be happy to give it to them. Now, there are common terms that we all need to know about when we're talking about solar power, and we know some of these terms already. kW is a unit of power, a kilowatt. A kilowatt hour is a unit of that power for an hour. This is typically the thing that's on all of your electric bills. This comes out every month on your monthly bill. A megawatt is 1,000 times larger than a kilowatt, so it's 1,000 kilowatts. A megawatt hour is that unit for 1 hour. A gigawatt is 1,000 times a megawatt, and a gigawatt hour is that unit for 1 hour. So, if you have a 1 megawatt solar array, these are things you need to know when you're reading the paper. So if you have a 1 megawatt solar array and you need to generate 1 gigawatt hour of electricity, it would have to operate at nameplate efficiency 2.4 hours per day, 365 days a year. So it's got to be operating at its nameplate efficiency. So if it's 1 megawatt, it needs to operate at that for 2.4 hours. But that's not really true, because I just put a new term in here which is called nameplate. Now, solar power is generated in DC, direct current, not alternating current. So to convert that to AC, it takes some of the power that you're actually generating to do it, so it's probably closer to 3 hours per day, 365 days a year. And I know where we live. We live in the southern tier. And in February, which we had a very light winter this winter, Jim and I drove up to see the Cornell University facility, and this is what we found. We found the Cornell University facility covered by, we had maybe this much snow over the night. So the whole thing was covered by it, and it was virtually generating no power. So it doesn't take very much to actually slow these things down. Now, the statewide renewable energy goals, and if you read the white paper, this is on page 9 in the white paper, the energy need after energy efficiency, and they're actually saying in this paper that we're going to be more efficient and consequently we're not going to use as much power. Now, I don't know about you guys, but everything that I read shows that we're actually increasing our population. Our population is not getting smaller in the world. So I think that if people want to continue using their cell phones and their computers and their microphones and their hair dryers and everything else, we're probably going to use a little bit. But let's go with the numbers that they have in the white paper. So the one thing that you can pick out of there is that between 2017 and 2020, the state's looking for an increase in 3,929 gigawatt hours from renewable energy sources. So you can find this information that I'm going to talk about on the internet too. It takes about 5 acres of land to actually generate 1 megawatt of power. So, and it will take over 17,000 acres of solar to achieve that goal. Actually, it's over 19,000 acres of solar. If it's all solar, if the renewable energy stuff's all done in solar between 2017 and 2020, it's actually going to take over 19,000 acres of solar to achieve that goal. That's the 2020 goal. That's not very far in the future. The 2030 goal is going to take nearly 10 times that amount. And you can pick this information out of Table 9 on the thing. Now, what Steve asked me to do is talk about environmental issues, which is the thing that I know the most about. Every time you do a project of any size, and I'm talking about a 10-acre project or a 5-acre project or a 20-acre or 40-acre project, there's always environmental issues. And the environmental issues are almost always the same. I'm not going to go into great details about them, but you always have a wetlands issue. Somebody's got to go out there and survey the land for wetland. And this could be a federal issue, it could be a state issue, or it could be both. Water bodies and stream crossings. Well, you saw in the Cornell one that they have wetlands in the middle, but federal and state agencies, once again, will be dealing with this. Threatened and endangered species. They're always an issue. These things always have to be done. So these solar projects are just like every other project. You have environmental issues that have to be done. Stormwater discharge? Sure. You have to do a stormwater. Anything that's over an acre in New York State, you've got to do a speedy permit submission on it. So you have to do that. State Environmental Quality Review Act? Yeah, absolutely. If you've got a big project and it's in one of your towns, you're going to have to abide by the rules and act. And that includes cultural resources. And in our area, cultural resources deals primarily with Indian artifacts, stone walls, old buildings. All of this stuff comes in. And you might have you might also have some local issues that your town brings up. And there's other things that are also involved in it, is that you could have traffic issues, all the same issues that we've talked about in other projects before. These are all going to have to be dealt with. So from a landowner standpoint, we have some rules. I have some rules for a landowner. If anyone's coming onto your property, and once again, this seminar is all about leases and stuff that you're going to be dealing with. If anyone's coming on your property to do surveys, and that would be someone like me, I've done surveys in over 32 different states, you need to have that person, through your attorney, prepare a limited license so that when that person comes on your property, you know what they're doing there. And they're actually agreeing to what you have in your limited license. It describes what they're planning to do, when they're planning to do it, who's going to do it, and it also includes insurance. They need to have insurance before they come. And when they're all done doing their surveys, you need to get copies of all of them. You should have copies of every survey. Now, I know that in some of the other issues that we've dealt with, Lisa, we had to fight to get copies of the surveys for the landowners. But you need to get copies of all the surveys, the reports, and the clearances. This assures that you have those clearances that are necessary and that the people that are coming on your property actually have obtained them. You need to have those copies. I would actually even recommend the next thing is that you actually get some of the, if you can, and Scott will talk about this later on, but I think this is a good thing. If there are certain things that need to be done in order to permit this project on your property, it needs to be included in your lease agreement. It needs to be. I talked to somebody, I'm going to say it had to be 4 or 5 years ago, that their comment to me was, all of this stuff is required by either the federal government or the state government, so we don't really want to put it in the lease agreement. My comment to that was, if it's all required, what's the problem with putting it in the lease agreement? Because if it's in the lease agreement, you not only have the resource agencies to protect you, but you also have the legal system to protect you. So there's no problem with doing it. It's a good thing to do. If you want a copy of of one of these limited licenses, if you go to that website that you see right down at the bottom, Brad at ccfbny.org, he has it, and that's Brad Vickers. Let's see, I might be almost done. Good sites for information: the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, www.nrel.gov, the DEC website, the Department of Public Services website, and NYSERDA. These are all good places to get information. A good place not to get information is from your neighbor. You want to actually do some research on yourself. And I'll tell you right now, right off the bat, be a skeptic. Be a skeptic. It's good for you. I mean, it'll protect you in the long run. All right, thank you very much.
Since I am involved in both the utility projects and the construction and so on, restoration, and the administration of the agricultural district law, I'm actually going to talk about sort of both phases of that when it comes to the solar issue. I'm going to start with the ag district law, and there's a couple things in there that are important to consider as a landowner. One is that, as some of you may know, if you're currently agricultural landowners, is that agricultural land qualifies for the agricultural exemption, ag value exemption. And so, you know, that's granted to land that's used for agricultural production, and the taxes are based on, you know, its value for agricultural production. If you take 5, 10, 20 acres and put solar panels on it, then it's going to be taken out of production, so that land will no longer qualify for the agricultural assessment. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is, once that conversion takes place, there's a penalty to be paid, because that's in the agricultural district law that when land is converted, that has been receiving the agricultural assessment, is converted to a non-agricultural use, then there's a penalty for that conversion. So as a landowner, that would be assessed to you, and you would have to, you know, that's something to consider with the lease and the lease agreement is, you know, are you going to be compensated for that? The other thing that I'm sure will come up, it hasn't yet, but we have a provision in the agricultural district law that says local municipalities cannot unreasonably restrict farm operations located in an agricultural district. And so there's a likelihood that as these projects start to take shape, the local municipalities may look at their local zoning and say, well, this area is not zoned for that, or we don't have solar in our local law, and therefore, since it's not in there, it's not a permitted use. Or there may be a requirement for site plan review or special use permit. And so oftentimes when those things happen in relationship to agriculture in an ag district, we get a call and say, well, you know, I think the town's unreasonably restricting me, can you review it? And if it's an agricultural practice, we can and we do, and then we usually go to the town and say, well, we've looked at your requirements for this and we think it's unreasonable and this is why, and so on. When it comes to solar, and this type of solar, it's not an agricultural practice. So you wouldn't be able to come to us and say, well, the town won't let us put 20 acres of solar panels on our property. Can you review that and determine if it's unreasonable? Our answer is going to be not an agricultural practice, we can't review it. If it were, and I know this is not the topic of today, but I just want to make this distinction, if you had a farm operation that was considering solar panels to offset their energy use on the farm, then that would be reviewable under 305A. So, because that's a non-farm use, it's a non-farm practice. So I just want to make that clarification that these larger wind or solar farms aren't considered an agricultural practice under 305A. So now for the actual construction and restoration and so on, some things to keep in mind and think about is if you were to have solar panels on a large scale installed on your property, how would that be connected to the grid or the distribution lines or the electrical system? If it's above ground, you got to think about where the pole placement's going to be to get that electricity to the existing wires. Are those poles going to be in your way? How many are there going to be? What's the spacing on them? So that's something to really think about with the above ground connection. If it's underground, then you need to think about, again, burial depth. How are they going to install them? How wide a trench is that going to require during construction to install those wires? And then how is it going to be restored? Is it, are they going to put topsoil back over, seed it down nice, and you wouldn't even know it's there? Or is it going to be left kind of rough, and that's going to be your responsibility to smooth it out and get it back the way it was? What are they going to need for access to the site? Are they going to need a permanent access road of some kind? And how long is that going to be? And where is it going to be? And what's it going to be constructed of? How, what types of materials? What's the drainage going to do once you put in a permanent access road? Is there going to be runoff from that road going on to the rest of your property? Is that road going to be flush with, if you've got some fields there that you might access from that road, is that road going to be flush with the rest of those fields so you can get on and off of that road? One thing we ran into with the larger wind farms that I was involved in is they, of course, had an access road to each turbine, and usually the surface of that road was a small crushed stone type material. They always wanted to keep the snow, with the exception of up on Tug Hill, they always wanted to keep those access roads open during the winter so they could get to those towers. So they were plowing snow every time they had to, and that crushed stone was ending up off in the fields. So that's something to kind of keep in mind is whatever, if there is an access road and there's some type of stone for a surface, are they going to need to keep that open during the winter? And if they do, how are they going to maintain it? How are they going to plow it? If the stone from that road gets pushed off into your field or onto your lawn or something, are they going to clean it up on a regular basis? How is that going to be treated? And then, as I mentioned, of course, the whole maintenance issue. Are they going to keep that road open? Is it going to be maintained by them on a regular basis? If there's drainage issues, are they going to be addressed? And then, of course, most of these things, from what I've heard so far, are going to be pretty long-term leases, but it's going to be important to think about what happens when that lease is up. Is everything going to be removed? If there's some type of concrete foundation that these things set on, is that all going to be taken out? How is it going to be restored? Is it going to be restored back to agriculture, or is it going to be just left to grow up to brush? So that's another important issue, is the restoration at the end of all of this. If there's overhead lines, are they going to be removed and the poles taken out, or is that going to be left there? And then finally, one of the things to think about is the actual land base itself and the loss of that in terms of agricultural production. If you are currently farming the property, you have to think about what will that loss of acreage do to my operation? Can I afford to lose 20 acres and still have a viable farm operation? Or can I pick up 20 acres someplace else? If you're renting that land to someone else, you have to kind of think about how that might affect their operation. And if you have 40 acres that you're renting to a farmer, and you take 20 of that and put solar panels on it and say, well, you can still rent the other 20 acres, they may decide that it's really not worth it, especially if there's a fair travel distance involved. They may say, well, I'm not interested in renting the other 20 acres, it's not worth my time to do that. And so then now you've got 20 acres that may be sitting there idle that before you were getting some rent on. So I think that's another really important issue is how does that loss of acreage affect farming operations, either yours or someone else's if you're renting it out. So those are some of the things that we've heard mentioned, some of the questions that have been asked to us, and so that's kind of in a nutshell what I think you need to think about in terms of the ag assessment and the construction and restoration and the real agricultural issues. So as they mentioned, we'll have questions at the end.
Thanks, Steve. My PowerPoint is going to be very, very brief. I want to save time for Q&A. This is an installation map showing the amount of radiation that is received by states across the country. And of course, you don't need to look at this map to question why would anybody want to lease for solar farms in New York State. You don't have to just look outside and you can see. But the thing that's really driving it, of course, are the tax incentives. So you have investment tax credit, which is very significant, 30%. You have bonus depreciation. You can write off half of that in the very first year. Whatever's left, you can write off over 5 years. But the thing the operator is very interested in are what's known as SRECs, or Solar Renewable Energy Certificates. Basically, that's the equivalent of 1 megawatt of electricity that's produced. They can sell these on the open markets because as the PSC comes out with their mandates, and we know exactly how much solar they want from the utilities, now they have to go out and buy it somehow. Well, they don't have to put up their own solar plants, but they can basically buy it from somebody else. And that's what these SREC markets are all about. We don't know how that's going to price out. It's all supply and demand. You can see that I've seen a high of $680 versus a low of $3. Now that's separate. That's completely separate from the sale of the electricity. So you got two different things that they're looking for. Here's your typical cash flows. You're going to have revenue, of course, from the electricity sales. The SREC sales are very, very significant. The expenses, you have operations and maintenance. Somebody's got to mow around those solar facilities. The big nut to crack is the lease payment to the tax equity partner. Those tax benefits that you saw earlier, really, they're going to go into business most likely with some sort of a tax equity partner, a company that could really use those benefits. And then one common way of doing it is what's known as a sale leaseback, where they'll develop the property, sell it off to whoever the tax equity partner is, and then lease it back from them. But that lease payment that they have to make every month can be very significant. And then property taxes. There's a 15-year exemption for the solar farms, but that's subject to the towns and counties can opt out of that, and school districts as well. But assuming that exemption is there, those property taxes come back full strength after 15 years. Now the problem is, we don't know how the SREC sales are going to go. If those SREC sales are strong, then fine, they'll probably have enough money to cover everything. But if they're weak, and they're designed to be weak, as time goes by and we get closer and closer to our targets, the value of those SRECs are going to drop. So sooner or later, that income's going to drop, and now it's going to be more and more of a challenge for them to meet that lease payment. In the future, all those tax benefits are all used up in 5 years. That 30% tax credit, they earn 20% of that each year. So at the end of 5 years, whoever that tax equity partner, they've got everything they're ever going to get out of that. So they're going to have to dump it. They'll probably sell it back to the operator or somebody else. And in 15 years, that property tax exemption is going to be gone. At some point, the value of those SRECs will be diminished. And at that point, what's it going to look like to the operator? And what are the farms going to look like if the operator can't afford maintenance? Let's say they're nearing bankruptcy, or they are bankrupt, and this is the company that you lease to. That could be a potential result. And that's something you all have to think about. Scott is, maybe you'll be talking about bonding as part of your presentation, I imagine. So I'll save the rest of it for later for Q&A, but that's my little PowerPoint.
So We're here talking today about how to protect landowners, how to protect you, and I'm sure that's why you're here, right? You want to know that if these opportunities come to you, that you're going about it the right way and making sure that you're maximizing your protection and also maybe maximizing the potential economic benefits that might come your way. We are seeing these things hit New York now in ways that we've never seen before. And that's largely because of the mandate that we have from our governor that by 2030, we will be 50% renewable. What that means is that that's going to be a gigantic effort. And Bob's talking about the amount of land space that will be needed in order to accomplish that. Bob, is it something like 300 square miles that would be necessary?
A lot of land.
About 300 square miles of land that will have to be covered with solar panels if we're using all solar. But it's solar, we'll have other mixes as well. There'll be wind in there as part of that equation for renewable. But as we know, wind takes a lot of its space as well. So with all of those issues coming to New York, we're seeing the companies coming here in a very big way. And they're coming here in ways that remind us of the early oil and gas days. Do you remember those days? A long time ago? When the companies came in and said, hey, I'm going to make you this offer. You know, it's here for a limited time, and here's the lease we use. And by the way, this is the lease we use throughout the country. So you're going to have to get this, and you've got a limited time offer. So unless you get in soon, you're going to miss this opportunity. Right? You remember, right? Those are the types of things that we heard. And then after a while, we became more educated about these issues. We saw what was going on in our neighboring state of Pennsylvania, couldn't believe some of the leases that were signed there, saw that leases were signed here in New York at $3 an acre, and thought, wow, this is not the way that it's supposed to be done, right? Because the financial terms certainly are poor, and certainly the lease terms are not the type of lease terms that provide the protections that we as landowners know are crucial to protect our property. So there is a wind developer, or solar developer, that has sent, reportedly in Sullivan County, 6,500 letters to landowners in that county, making offers about putting solar farms on their property. And we're talking about solar farms, by the way. I don't know if Bob had mentioned this, but the one to Cornell, how many acres is that one?
It's around 10.
That one was about 10 acres at Cornell. We're talking about solar farms now that might be 20 acres, 50 acres, 80. I've got leases that have 100 acres of land in that one solar farm lease. And that entire 100 acres now is going to be encumbered by that solar farm lease. So we are really talking about massive operations on your property. So you really have to be careful about how you're going to be proceeding. Some of the offers that are going out there, we're seeing landowners signing up their properties on 40-year leases for $250. I'm not talking about $250 an acre either. I'm talking $250 to bind someone for a 40-year lease. And landowners are doing it. And we sit here, and probably preaching to the choir because you know enough to come and be educated on these issues. But we sit here and we're like, how could that be? You know, with everything that we've been through, how is it possible that somebody can bind themselves on a 40-year lease, not negotiate a single term in that lease for $250? So that's what's happening, right? And it's happening because of various things. It's happening because the economic climate in our area is poor. It's happening because some of us thought there was going to be an opportunity, and now there's another opportunity knocking at the door, so we think we better answer this one quickly. It's happening because they're saying some of the same things that we saw other companies tell landowners. That, hey, as soon as that substation fills up, we're not gonna be able to lease any more properties. So you better get in quick. Oh, and by the way, don't negotiate many of those terms, because if you do, our investors are not gonna like that lease anymore. And if they don't like the lease, then they're not gonna develop your property, and you're gonna miss out on the opportunity there. So, oh, and you don't need a lawyer. So, I don't like that one. Those are the types of things that are going on right now throughout the state, right? I'm talking to landowners in Broome County, Delaware County, Orange County, Greene County, Schoharie County, and I just got a call the other day from someone who lives in Fulton. And that's just in our area. I'm sure the western part of the state, there are people that are looking at these issues too. So it's coming here in a very big way, and you know, primarily what we want to do is say, look, these are opportunities that might be worth it for us to proceed and to try to take advantage of and to enter into these deals. But let's make sure that we're doing it in the way that we should be and making sure that we're protecting our property in the process. So, here's the other thing, right? And I've seen this too already. The lease that is being offered by some of the companies that are out there, again, they're saying there's really not much we can do. If we negotiate that lease, make any changes, our investors aren't going to like it. So we're seeing landowners taking that lease, no negotiations whatsoever. And sometimes they don't even understand what the market rate is, right? So, for instance, I know for sure that there are landowners that have taken leases that for just asking for an additional rental, they could have got another $500 an acre per year. You know, we're seeing ranges right now that go from $1,000 to $1,500 per acre per year, right? So that's not too bad if you get developed. And that's the idea here. We have to be careful about it. But for the landowner who just took that lease and didn't ask for the additional $500 that everybody else in the area is getting, like, just think about what a mistake that is. If you've got 20 acres and you missed out on $500 an acre, over 40 years, you just made a $400,000 mistake. So you really have to make sure that you understand what the market rates are, what the lease terms are, and that you're careful about how you're proceeding. So, an offer comes to you. What are the things that you should be thinking about? First, I think that everyone needs to think about, well, what does this really mean in terms of me really locking up maybe 50 acres of my property for a solar farm? I'm going to completely take it off the grid, so to speak. Right? I'm not going to be able to use that property anymore for the next 40 years. Is that going to be all right with me? Is that going to be okay with whoever I leave my property to? Right? Those are the types of questions you should be asking yourself. What happens to the value of the property? Right? The value of the property is certainly going to be affected by a 50-acre solar farm, right? And will the money that you make in that offer, will that come close to the potential value of what you're going to lose in the deal? What's going to happen to the value of my neighbor's property? Right? And is that something that I should be thinking about as well? Because I know that if somebody builds a 50-acre solar farm next to my property, right, there's going to be an impact. And that's just the way that some of these things go. What about financing? Right? Let's say that I'm looking at potentially refinancing loans I've got, or that I might need other financing in the future. Will this impact my ability to get that type of bank financing? Will a bank want to give a loan on a property with 50 acres of solar panels on it? We don't know the answer to that yet, but we certainly can guess, because now a bank is going to look at this and what is the first thing they're going to think? If that solar company is no longer there, the operation is not going on, and I'm stuck with, as a bank, 50 acres of solar panels, what's the cost of that going to be? So I think the banks are going to be taking a hard look at that and making some decisions about whether they want to move forward with that. The commercial use concept, you absolutely have to be looking at that issue. If you've got an agricultural assessment, you have to factor in what that means. And if it turns out that you're going to lose a portion of your agricultural assessment so that now you've got greater values, you've got rollback penalties that are going to be incurred, you've got to make sure that those lease documents are covering those things, and that is going to be reimbursed to you in the process. What are you using your property for right now? Right? Are there trees in the property that you might lose? Are there crops in the property that you might lose? What about quarries? Somebody asked me the other day, you know, I've got the ability to mine some of my property. How's this going to impact me? Well, for sure, you're not going to be able to have a quarry under a solar panel, because the lease documents for these solar leases protect everything within that solar array. So if they decide that they're going to have a lease over the 50 acres, there are really no operations that can go on there. So those sorts of surface operations, they're completely gone, because the surface is entirely used now. It's entirely covered by those solar panels. One of the things, though, that you want to protect is the subsurface rights. So you've got to make sure that in the process you're protecting your mineral rights. And that can be done if you're asking for it. And some of the provisions that I've seen make it look like they're reserving your right to preserve your mineral rights, but they're not quite that good. Like some of them are saying, for instance, that they've got that you have the right to enter into other leases, but only with the complete consent of the solar company. Right? So what does that mean? If it says something like that, right, where it's entirely within their discretion, That means that you might want to enter into a lease, but they may say that you can't do it at all. And you've got to be careful because it might not just be covering that 50 acres that covers the solar panel. If they've described the area in question as your entire land, maybe you have 150 acres, it could exclude the entire 150 acres. So those are the types of things that you've really got to be careful about when you're talking about how you're negotiating these leases. Okay, so I've decided that, all right, I think I can enter into this deal, right? In fact, I got a call from landowner. They were doing dairy farming. They decided that, we don't want to be in this business anymore. We've been at it for a long time. And this is an opportunity for us to move forward. So we think that we want to enter into this deal. This will help us to be able to pay our taxes, help us to provide, give us some money to live on, and allow us to stay in our home. So, okay, they're going to proceed. What we don't know, by the way, is whether they're actually going to move forward in that project. So the first thing I said is, please don't sell the cows. Right? You're going to enter into a lease for $250, but you have then this long due diligence period. So that $250, this is true with all these solar leases, wind leases, there's always a due diligence period that starts the process. So in many of the leases that we're seeing that a $250 payment for a 6-month due diligence period. And then another payment of $1,800 for an additional 18 months of a due diligence period. So for about $2,000, you'll have about a 2-year due diligence period. But at the end of that due diligence period, if they decide they don't want to move forward, then there's no lease. That maybe $1,000 an acre or $1,500 an acre per year that you thought was going to be coming your way is not going to come your way if they decide they're going to walk away. So for that first 6 months, on that first $250 payment, they could make that decision then. At the end of the 6 months, they don't want to move forward. After that, if they pay you the additional $1,800 and you move forward for the next 18 months, they'll do some more due diligence. And the due diligence is basically looking at the electric, making sure that the electric is sufficient, making sure that the easements work for them, making sure that they've worked out agreements with the utility and with the town, and permitting issues that they have got to deal with, other state environmental issues that they have to comply with. But once they get past all those hurdles, if they finally decide they want to move forward, it's only then that they'll enter into that construction phase and start paying that yearly rental. So don't make decisions about how this is going to go until you know that you're actually going to reach that phase. So don't sell the cows, in the case of my clients that I was speaking with earlier, until they know. You can't do it. That also means that for the next 2 years, you're locked up. And most of these leases also say that if a better offer comes along in the process, you can't take it. Again, that $250 locks you in for at least for that due diligence period until they terminate, but it's entirely within their discretion if they want to keep that process going for another 40 years. Okay, so now we got to the point where we've decided we want to move forward. We've looked at all the potential issues, the issues of value, things like that. We're still willing to enter into the deal. So now let's look at the lease terms. And when Matt was talking about, well, we really want to make sure that the roads are done correctly and the access roads are put in properly, and if any rocks are done during snow plowing, that those are taken care of. Those are the things that we want to address. But remember what I was telling you earlier is that this company, or some companies, are saying, we're not negotiating anything. Right? So those provisions, while they're great to get, right, you might not get them. And then you might have some decisions about what's going to happen next. One of the biggest decisions I think that you'll have to make is in regard to a removal bond. And this is, I think, is where everybody has the greatest risk right now. Because, under the federal law, right, if the federal government, the Bureau of Land Management, puts a solar farm on federal lands, they've got to have it bonded, right? But even the Office of General Accountability has looked at the federal government on this, and they've said, you know what? We think that, sorry, I was just reading. This is from the United States Government Accountability Office. The Federal Bureau of Land Management has limited assurance that bonds for wind and solar rights of right-of-way will cover reclamation costs, leaving the federal government potentially at financial risk if developers do not complete reclamation. Well, that's the federal government. they're getting bonds for their projects, but will you get any bond whatsoever? Right? And that's one of the major issues that concerns us. The developers are resisting very strongly putting any bonding requirements in these leases. And what does that mean? Right? If solar in the next few years is not the energy of the day, right? Where are they going to be? If the solar company is out of business, will they actually come back and remove this entire project? You know what it's going to take to remove 50 acres of solar panels? Right? You know, does anybody know what landfill is taking solar panels right now in New York State? They're not out there, right? You've got concrete pillars that are put into the property. Are those concrete pillars going to be removed? And you know what the expense of removing those pillars will be for 50 acres of solar panels? One of the companies that I really enjoyed working with has been Sun Edison. Sun Edison, for instance, just to give you an example of some of the market rates, Sun Edison is paying a client of mine with a 15-acre solar panel $15,000 per year for that due diligence period. Right? That's the type of market rates that we want to see. And their approach to the process is really quite different. Their approach to the process was, let's get in there, look at the particular property in advance, see where the solar array is going to go, see where the easements are going to go, make sure all of those plans are done, and then move forward with the project. That's how we want to see it. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported, Sun Edison said to be preparing to file for bankruptcy. Sun Edison, whose stock has plunged in recent months, would rank among the largest financial collapses in recent years. The company, based about 20 miles outside of St. Louis, used a combination of financial engineering and cheap debt to grow to be one of the country's biggest developers of renewable power plants. And now they could be filing bankruptcy. So what does that mean for us? You know, that means that this concept of having a removal bond in place so that if one of these companies goes bankrupt and doesn't have the ability to come and remove the project, the bond is big. If you can't get it in the lease, we really want our municipalities looking at these issues. I see Lois Dilworth is here. The town of Barker, for instance, has said we want to start looking at these issues a lot closer, and the town of Barker has put a moratorium on all solar farms so that they can examine the issues and decide what the municipalities should be doing. All of the municipalities should be looking at these issues because from what I can tell, I think the state has largely said these are issues that we're going to have everybody treat at the local level, the landowners and the municipalities. I don't see a bonding requirement at the state level for solar farms. And that's not true, by the way, if you put a quarry on your property, there's a bond requirement that's required by the state. If you put an oil and gas well on your property, there's a bond requirement. But there's no state requirement for that to happen if you put a 50-acre solar farm on your property. So that means these are issues that we've got to be paying attention to, both in terms of protecting ourselves and our communities should be looking at these issues as well. Okay, there's one provision. Too much talking later. Jim and I were speaking at Penn State this week. It's been a long week. This concept of removing the property and reclaiming it, right? What do we want to see in our leases? What we want to see are provisions that say everything you bring in, you got to take out when you're done, right? And you've got to restore the land to the condition that it was in before. And you've got to make sure that we can continue to use it. What about pesticide use on the property? And what's the impact of having 40 years of pesticides used in order to control vegetation between the solar panels? You know, will you be able to farm that property at the end of the 40 years? Right? Can you get in your lease documents provisions that say pesticides, herbicides, biocides should not be used on the property at all? Right? Potentially, you can if you're negotiating hard for them, but I will tell you that you're not going to see those to start out in any lease at all. So you've really got to be thinking about those potential issues. I've seen a provision that said that our obligation to restore the property is to avoid a risk of harm to the public. What does that mean? That means that if I go on the property, I'm not going to trip on something, and I'm not going to fall in some hole. But does that mean that my property is put back the way that it should be? Right? It certainly doesn't. Right? And I've been talking to companies about that and giving them examples of things that we've seen with pipeline companies and loggers, and those are things that we don't want to have happen. We want to make sure that if they're in the property, they put it back together, they reseed it, they revegetate it, and, you know, that it's able to grow it and look like a normal property, not like a property that's been under commercial development for a long time. So the reclamation provisions are big. The boundaries for the lease. So this is where, like for instance, when I was saying, you got the Sun Edison concept, where you're going to look at all these issues in advance and then figure out how that's going to fit the lease. This, what I would call a very large land grab that's going on right now, right, is not doing that at all. Right? These $250 offers that are out there, nobody is coming to your property in order to make that offer. There's some office in California where they go on Google Earth and they figure out what your property looks like. They check the records from the public records, determine if there's any liens, mortgages, things like that, and that's when you end up getting an offer. But they have no idea what your property actually looks like, other than from what it looks like on Google Earth. And they have no idea where the easements are going to go. And so instead what they've done is that they've drafted a lease that is extremely broad, right? That gives them broad easement rights in advance, that says that we have the right to put easements anywhere at all on the solar array and anywhere else that we need to on the rest of your property. In addition, if there could potentially even be rights to easements in adjacent property. Oh, and on top of it, if you've got any properties that you own within a certain distance away from this property, you're not able to put a solar lease on that property unless it's with our company. So there are these very broad rights that are written into these leases, and it's because of this concept that they have where they're just blanketing the area with as many leases as they can, trying to grab land for $250, and then they'll work out the details later on. You really have to be careful about those provisions. At least you need to be negotiating mutual consent provisions that say, look, I understand there need to be easements in order to remove the power from the property, but that should be done on mutual consent. I'm not going to hold it up unreasonably, but at least we should be doing this so that we all agree on where the locations of these easements should be. Existing improvements, right? The leases that I'm seeing say that if there are existing improvements in that solar array, after they decide where they actually want to put it, that those existing improvements can be removed by the solar company in their sole discretion, not yours. So, you know, what we're doing on those is we're saying, look, first of all, if there's any structures at all that are in the property, we need to know that in advance, and we need to make sure that we are getting those addressed up front. So if it turns out, for instance, that, and I just had a piece of property that was being used for another use, another farming use, we had to specifically carve it out and make sure that that was the only, that area was completely excluded from the potential solar array. Timber provisions, we're not seeing timber provisions coming in. And I imagine, right, we're going to have land completely clear cut in order to put in these solar arrays. If that's happening, you should be getting compensation for the timber that has to be removed. But we're not seeing those at all in the initial drafts of these leases that are coming through. What we're hearing from the companies is that, well, you know, it's very expensive to remove trees, and in addition to the trees, we have to remove the stumps. Yeah, we know. But that's all a big cost to us, and so we don't want to do that. So they're actually resisting putting in timber provisions. You can get them, and you should get them, but you've got to be very careful about how that's going to go up front. Obviously, if you've got a timber farm that brings into play some of the 488 exemptions, you've got to be extremely careful about that. This sort of operation is going to cause you to have some sort of, it's going to cause you to have rollback on the prior tax benefits. That brings into play the tax provisions in these leases where they have to be very clear, right? Any additional taxes that are incurred because of the operation, the solar company has to pay. Any rollback on something like that where you've got some sort of conservation easement or timber program where you've received tax benefits, they need to pay that rollback. Any increase in the assessment that's occurred. There might not be an immediate assessment increase because of the real property tax law that exempts them for 15 years, but we got to make sure that we're covered 15 years from now, so that when that exemption does go up, and for a 50-acre solar farm, what's that assessed value? Could be a couple $1 million, right? So imagine having to pay an assessed value of a couple $1 million. it's crucial that that tax provision is in your lease to make sure that they're covered. And it just really should be as broad as possible. Any additional tax increases that are incurred because of this operation is a tax increase that the company should pay. The termination of a lease, for instance, we need to make sure that, I've seen restrictions on sales of houses, for instance, right? There's actually provisions where if you look at them, you say, you know what? They may have approval over whether I can actually sell my property. So you, again, have to be extremely careful about when you're looking at these provisions. I think, the other thing that we will be seeing are more transmission lines. We know that our infrastructure for electric in this state is not what it needs to be already. And so we're absolutely going to be seeing transmission lines that are coming through. Now we see a lot of pipelines that are being built or some proposed and waiting to be built. But there, we're talking about making sure that you're compensated properly for underground pipelines. Now we're going to be seeing, I think, if we're in order to accomplish the goals of 50% renewables by 2030, now we're going to be seeing more transmission lines put throughout the state, and we'll be dealing with those issues of eminent domain and making sure that we're properly compensated for overhead lines. We've also talked about the cumulative impacts. If we're going to have 300 square miles of solar panels throughout our state, what are the cumulative impacts of all of this development throughout the state? And shouldn't our state be looking at those issues right now? And those are the things that we would like them to pursue. So those are some of the general issues. I think the message today is, make sure you're getting educated, and you guys are already ahead. But make sure you're asking questions, make sure you're negotiating properly, make sure you don't buy the lines that these companies give you. I caution everyone, there seems to be this tendency to say, these are renewable companies, so they must be kinder and friendlier. Their bottom line is no different than any other company. They want to make money, but the margins in this industry are very tight. And so they're out there trying to do what they can to make as much money. And if they don't have to give you a protection, they're certainly not going to do it unless you're asking for it. Thank you.
For any member of the panel, I understand that towns can opt out of the tax breaks that you get for solar. Does that mean if my town decides to opt out on the tax breaks because so many people got the tax break, they couldn't afford to keep up with it? Will my property now be taxed as a commercial property because I'm selling energy?
I think that's the concern, right, is that there will be an increased assessed value. It's supposed to be exempted. I think it's 47 of the real property tax law. But the thing is, if the lease is done correct, right, so that any increase in assessment is covered by the solar company, then you should be fine. But it raises the other issue is that, we saw development coming in here where we expected, like for pipelines, for instance. When pipelines were coming in, Windsor had their school taxes reduced by what? 6%. Right? We're not going to see those types of tax benefits from renewable energy because of these exemptions. So even though there might be a 50-acre solar farm that's out there that is producing electric, right, you're not going to have any kind of corresponding ad valorem tax that goes back to communities. But protect yourself in the lease document to make sure that if those things happen and your towns opt out, then you're covered. Towns, you need to be looking at these issues, right? You need to make these decisions about whether this is something you want to do. You have to decide whether a solar farm of this nature fits the character of your town. Take a look at your comprehensive plans and make the decisions about, is this something that we want to do? And maybe you've got to revise some of those comprehensive plans, dealing with issues about wind, solar. We've seen biofarms coming into play as well. There are various towns that are starting to enact their own provisions with respect to bonding requirements, so that if a building permit is required for a solar farm, then the town will require there to be a bond for that project as part of the issuance of the building permit. I like that concept a lot, because then if I can't get that in my lease document, at least I know that the town is back there and the town is going to require that bond. The town of Brookhaven, which is I think in Suffolk County, they've got a renewable energy law that covers some of that.
That is 487 of the real property tax law. And school districts can opt out as well. It's not just towns. The school district can opt out of the exemption.
Okay, questions? Right here, Brad.
Yeah, someone told me on the solar panels, there's a liquid inside and it's hazardous if it leaks out. Is that true?
The answer is no, but there are, in the construction of these solar panels, there are several hazardous materials that are using in it. And one of the things that you're most concerned about is sometime down the line, when they actually take the solar panels out and they recycle them, they're gonna have to do with that. There's cadmium that's involved in it, there's also silver that's involved in it, because silver's such a good conductor of electricity. Those things are gonna have to be dealt with sometime down the line. The stuff that you're talking about, the hazardous material, that's at the manufacturing site. And seeing that most of our solar panels are manufactured in China, we don't really pay any attention to that.
What's the expected life use, Don?
What's that?
What's the expected life use of the solar panel?
We don't really know, but most of them have some kind of a warranty for 20 to 25 years on them, producing most of the power that they still do. Go ahead.
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry.
no, you're fine. You're doing a good job. Keep it up.
Since the Public Service Commission has created this with the governor of New York, do we know if they're actually going to regulate these companies in our behalf? After all, that's their charge, is to protect the people and give us a good energy supply. Are they going to regulate these industries for the public's benefit?
That's a great question. And the white paper that's out right now, that's asking for comments on what they're going to do, that would be a great comment to make to the Public Service Commission so that they can actually deal with it in their next meetings where they're actually going to mandate stuff. And I'm actually thinking of numbers of questions and responses myself to put in. But I think that one of the things that Scott brought up, I think that the cumulative impact of everything should be brought in, just like they did with the GEIS for, the SGEIS for natural gas development. This particular development of solar farms looks to be like the perfect thing to do a generic environmental impact statement that covers most of the issues. And it should be done. I don't know why it's not.
I guess I'm next. This seems fraught for the landowners if you enter into this lease, and even if you have all the bells and whistles that Scott's talking about, and then so your tax goes up eventually, but they're supposed to cover it. But if that company goes out of business or bankrupt, is the landowner still going to be responsible, even though they had it in the lease that, you know, they aren't responsible?
I don't want to make this seem like a transaction that no one should do, because I don't think that's the case. I mean, this is being done throughout the country right now, and it's being done in ways that are good, right? And renewable energy, you know, for whatever you think of that, you know, it's an important part of the energy equation throughout the country right now. So I think that there are ways that you can do it, but there are also some things that if you're not careful about how you're doing them, then I think that they can come back and really take away some of the economic benefit to the entire project. Now, maybe that doesn't happen for 30 years or 40 years, and you and I aren't going to be here. I don't think we should be looking at it that way. I do think that some people are looking at it that way, and for the rest of us, we might be stuck with the burdens that brings.
Back here. Hi, this would be for anyone. Have any of our local towns made rulings yet on permitted use for solar installations? And also, are any companies right now contacting people within the southern tier or triple cities?
Well, certainly, the county is looking at developing a solar farm. I think you're aware of, most people are aware of that the county is working on developing a solar farm at the industrial park in Conklin. It's one of the things that clearly is happening in this area.
Also, the town of Windsor has
gone through their comprehensive plan, and part of that did address solar as potentially a permitted use, but that hasn't been worked into the zoning yet.
Hi, I'm Adam Flint. I work for Southern Tier Solar Works, which is a nonprofit program with the Binghamton Regional Sustainability Coalition. I'm really glad that there's so many people who have an interest in this, and I would agree with Scott that any land lease you sign, you really want to retain a qualified attorney. This is more FYI than a question.
Adam, we're trying to keep it to questions, please.
Do you want to know about payment in lieu of taxes? Could you answer that question?
Sure.
Because that's obviously a way
Sure, but we
that
want
people can
just
get
word it as a
municipal-
question, if you would.
All right, my question, and I have two questions. The first question is, do you think that a payment in lieu of taxes is something that municipal authorities should look for rather than opting out? Because if you do opt out, you can't be selective, and it means that no resident can go solar economically in your municipality. The second question is, I'd like to know if the JCL will be interested in partnering with some of the solar professional associations in a future program. Is there a number of issues that I think need to be discussed in these programs that haven't been brought up yet?
Well, I can address your second question, and there were, I even reached out and called you, Adam, but you never called me back.
That's because Melissa called you and she knows.
Okay, and the answer, and Melissa has the same answer that you would have gotten, that the JLC would be glad to discuss those potential partnerships. But here what I'm saying is discuss them. I'm not making any commitments for the JLC at this point. Melissa knew that when she called me. Scott, do you want to address his first question?
So, what Adam is talking about is that under this real property tax law 47, remember we said that the municipalities can opt out of that, right? So that the that assessment, that increased assessment is not exempted. But the other way that the municipality can handle that is a payment in lieu of taxes. So instead of even addressing the assessment, they can say, well, look, we think the assessment would have gone up by $1 million, and let's say $2 million. And this is what the tax would have been if that were produced. And instead what we're going to do is we're going to take X number of dollars instead as a payment in lieu. Does that accurately sum it up, Adam? That's
We defer to Melissa because she's a 10-year experience.
That's the concept. So municipalities have the ability to make that decision to take the payment instead of worrying about the tax assessment. But I'm not sure how much that has really gone on in New York right now. And I think certainly here in Broome County, it's not an issue that we've addressed at all. So those are the things that are going to be coming up on a regular basis. What we've asked the municipalities to do is start looking at these issues and making sure that they understand how they work and what the potential benefits are. As I looked at I was looking at the New York Sun site on this issue, and I think it's really, there's not a lot of guidance about where municipalities should go and what they should be doing. Adam, is there a recommendation you think that they should have?
There is, in fact, on the New York Sun site, a link to the PV Sun Trainers Network. They have, in fact, come to Broome County before, and these are professionals whose job it is to come at the request of municipal officials and others to bring hard information about all of these issues: leasing, permitting, zoning. So some of these, there's a class in town of Shenango in a few weeks for officials. It's being organized by the county. There are lots of places to go to get good information from the state and from solar professionals, regardless of whether you're an official or not.
And I think you're right. New York Sun is that resource for the municipalities. But the point is that the municipalities need to be looking at these issues, because I think a large part of the way that this has been structured is the municipalities to be educated on it and start making decisions about how they're going to handle these issues.
If you have a mortgage on your property, do you need a release from your mortgage holder?
You might. I mean, depending upon what the solar company will say, they might. But the funny thing is, of the got about 10 projects pending right now, none of them have mortgages on their property.
They look at that.
They look at that in advance and decide what they want to do. Right. Oftentimes, they don't want to deal with the bank.
Okay, look, again, ladies before gentlemen, you'll be next, sir.
Have the professionals done a study of the Broome County area in regards to choosing wind power versus solar?
in a previous life, I was involved with trying to get some wind turbines up further north, but most of the area around here just isn't good enough. There's just not enough wind to really, with the exception of a few hilltops. But most of the strong wind is way up north along Lake Ontario, Lake Erie. There's a pocket between Buffalo and Rochester that comes down. Of course, you get over into northeastern Lake Ontario, there's awesome wind up in Tug Hill and so forth. But around here, it's just not good enough to make it economic.
There's actually been some federal studies that have mapped out the potential for wind power, and our southern tier community is not in one of the more viable, commercially, industrial viable areas for wind power. You can find those maps online.
I'm sorry, hang on, one more.
Who was it? AWS, American Wind, whatever it is. You go online there and you can get into a map of New York State and hone right in on your own individual property, and they'll tell you what they think of it. And I've done that with some properties around here, and all of them are coming up with the lowest recommendation, which is very poor wind.
My question is for Matt, if he's still up there. I can't see. How will Ag and Markets determine what the footprint is of the solar facility? And is that clear in terms of when decisions about the amount of acreage that would be influenced by development and the ag assessment?
We won't make that determination, your assessor will. So they'll look at, how much land was actually taken out of production, and then they'll make the adjustment that way. You probably will have to have a new soil group worksheet done, because that's based on, the one you currently have is based on the land that's in production now. And so if you take 20 acres out of production, put it in solar, you'll have to go into the Soil and Water Conservation District, get a new soil group worksheet that subtracts those soils out, and then reapply with your assessor.
I think my question is for Bob. Bob, I studied engineering a couple of years across the Harlem River from the Sherman Creek plant and breathed all those terrible fumes. That's eliminated. We have very clean air now. But I still understand that most of our electricity comes from large turbines constantly spinning, and it's done very economically. The NICEAG bill said that we get most of our energy from the burning of methane and from the use of uranium right here, and that the cost of electric has fallen below the national average. And I'm just wondering at how much more it's going to cost to use solar when the sun goes down and there's no output from the solar panels. Does that mean that they have to bring the turbines online? Does that mean that with every 24-hour period or every time the clouds come, the turbines have to be switched off and then restarted? Now, what kind of a mess is it that's being created, and how much more is it going to cost us, Bob? Do you have any idea?
Well, actually, I'm a biologist. So the answer to your question is, I'll just kind of waltz around it for a minute. Probably most of you people in the audience here know that in New York State we get a tremendous amount of our power from hydroelectric. About 17% of our power comes from hydroelectric. Now we've actually done the environmental assessment for maybe 50 hydropower stations in New York State back in the 90s when they were all getting relicensed and everything. And I'll tell you right now that all of the good sites for hydropower in New York State have been taken. I've gone around we've looked at places like the Rock Bottom Dam here. We looked at the Delta Dam, which is one of the ones that the state's looking at again, up near the Rome Utica area, which is a very big dam. But every one of my clients walked away from it because there's not enough water to make it profitable. However, if the state throws enough money at it, it'll be profitable for somebody. But and we also get about 31% of our power in New York State from nuclear. So we're right around, and we've got some solar and we've got some wind in there. So we're right around right now getting about 50% of our power in New York State from things that do not emit carbon dioxide. Nuclear is one of them, of course. So the answer to your question is we have base load in New York State. We have base load in New York State provided by nuclear, we have base load provided by hydroelectric, and we have base load provided by some of our fossil fuel plants, many of which are being shut down because they're not going to be able to meet the EPA regulations on emissions. But yes, it's a problem, and it's a problem around the world as to how to integrate the solar power into the grid. It's a real problem because, as you say, it's intermittent. And right now, I don't think anybody knows, and there are places around the world, I'm going to say Hawaii is one of them, and the Philippines are another one, where when the sun comes up, because they have a lot of sun, and they already have their baseline going, it's actually throwing their grids offline, because now they get this big blast of electricity into their lines, and they don't have a method to do it. I'm guessing that this is something that technologists will actually work with, and somebody will figure it out. That didn't answer your question, but it gave me a chance to rattle on.
I talked to the Ag Assessment Office assessor about in Tompkins County, for dual purposing the land under the solar panels, and as long as they were being farmed in some aspect, they did not see that they were going to be exempting or taking away the ag value exemption on the property if you were still farming it under the panels, which they do quite extensively in Puerto Rico. So you can negotiate with your solar company to be able to do that, the way they set the panels up, the height of them, etc., the distance between the rows. Does the Ag and Markets have a opinion on being able to dual purpose the property and still have it count as ag land?
I don't think we've come to a conclusion on that yet, only because we've kind of discussed that possibility, and so far we haven't come up with a way of doing that with the crops and the livestock and so on that we have, other than sheep was one thing somebody mentioned might work. But we don't think goats will, because they'll be climbing on them. So we talked about that and how that would be addressed if it happens, but right now we've kind of looked at it and said, boy, I don't know what you could grow under there, and then you get into the whole lease thing of is the company going to let you? Are they going to be willing to work with you on that? So if that does start to look like it may take shape, then we're going to have to address that. But right now, I guess we don't have a solid answer on that.
There's another feature, and that has to do with why these solar panels are low. If you look at Cornell, or if you go, you've probably seen the one out by Cortland, most of them are down low, and surprisingly, they're not upright, so they can capture the maximum sun power that's coming through. They're low for two reasons. One is for wind. They got to keep them low so that the wind won't get underneath and blow them away. But the other reason is rutting, and that has to do with rainwater coming off and hitting the panels. If they're steep, you got rainwater running up that thing really quickly, and as it falls off, it's just going to wash topsoil away like crazy. And you can go up to Cortland, you can see it. Even though it was low, there's still rutting going on there. It's not a lot, but so if you raise these panels so you can do something underneath, you've just created another environmental problem.
This is just kind of interesting. To me, it's interesting. And I looked at a couple of these solar farms where they actually put sheep in to keep the stuff from growing back up. But I think that it's kind of interesting because sheep are ruminants, they're like cows and everything else, and they burp up a lot of methane every day, about 30 liters a day. So if you got sheep in there, and I saw where one place they put sheep in so they didn't have to actually run mowers. So now you've got 40 sheep in this place, and they're burping up methane every day, but they're doing it every day. So, and everything has some kind of impact. You think you're doing something good, it has some kind of impact. So, I think that putting sheep in is just kind of a feel-good thing. Not really. It really isn't that much of a benefit.
Back?
Yes. My question is there a danger of over-regulation on this issue as the county gets involved and the townships get involved, and so that landowners will get to the point where they won't have any real say in what they're doing with their own properties.
Well, first, New York would never overregulate anything.
It's a great question though, because I think this industry this industry works if the economics are there, if the state is providing benefits, if there's both the state and the federal benefits that really help the industry along. Without those, it's very difficult for the industry to survive. And so, to the extent that we're adding regulations, we're also making it more expensive. And just like any industry, then it becomes more difficult for that industry to work. So, yes, I think as there's more regulations, it's more difficult. The concern I have is I want to make sure that the focus in New York is not just do everything we can to help the industry come into the state. There has to be a balance to make sure that the landowner interests are protected and the state is looking at those too. And in addition, our local municipalities. So that really is what everyone in this room, needs to make sure that the focus stays on those issues.
As I walk up to take the next question.
Wait, hang on for 1 second.
Oh, sorry, Bob.
I just want to say one thing about regulations. I'm old enough, you can tell by looking at me, that I remember before the EPA was formed, I remember before the Clean Water Act, I remember before the Clean Air Act. I'm actually a fan of regulations. My biggest problem I have with regulations, and Matt, don't take this personally, but I think that the regulations are great as long as they stay at Matt's level, but when the regulations get up in the DEC to the top floors and stuff, and they become political issues, and the regulations are either not administered the way they should be, that's a problem. The problem's not with the regulations so much, the problem's with the administering of the regulations.
As I walk up front to take the next question, I'd like to ask a question myself. How many millions or hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars is being spent on subsidizing this and literally forcing solar and wind down our throats?
I can't tell you in terms of total dollars, but coming back to the discussion about the SRECs, for example, that's all determined by supply and demand. The demand is going to be set by the PSC. Well, every state has their own requirements. So the demand is going to be set by the government, and that's going to be determined by politics. And how fast do we want these solar panels, and by what year? And so the price of the SRECs is going to be passed on to the ratepayers. And you saw, I had up earlier about the 30% investment tax credit and a rapid write-off. Well, that's a benefit for somebody, and and I know the homeowners are getting it when they put up their panels and so forth, but the taxpayers are paying for that, one way or the other. One way or the other, somebody's paying for that. So you got the ratepayers. I think you're going to see pushback down the road from the ratepayers. I think you're going to see pushback from the taxpayers, and I think you're going to see pushback from the utilities. Because when you get, let's say if you had 2,000 of those, or let's say 1,000 of those 2 megawatt facilities, you're up in the 2,000 megawatt range. And that's there's nothing during the night, but all of a sudden, at 10 o'clock, it starts peaking out. And then it comes off. Well, that's the equivalent of a nuclear power plant. Utility guys are going to go nuts trying to figure out how to deal with that much juice coming on the line so suddenly and then dropping off. So I'm thinking there's going to be pushback all over the place. I don't think any of us are against solar. Personally, I love solar. But I think we're here to watch out for the interests of the landowners to make sure they don't get screwed.
Is the real property tax exemption the same for homeowners as the commercial? And if so, can you opt out of commercial and in for homeowner, or?
I'm not sure if any of us here are qualified to answer that question. I think we'll have to pass on it, I'm sorry.
Okay, back here.
Hi. Don't you think that before the New York State pushes the renewable energy, there should be some sort of plan on what happens when the solar panels are dead and when the wind turbines no longer work? happening because there's no end plan.
What do I think?
I mean, don't
It's certainly a good point.
voices saying before we say we have to have 300,000 acres of solar panels planned, should be some sort of thing about where do the dead solar panels go?
The white paper that Bob discussed.
One of the things I said before, and I actually believe this, is that this is the perfect place for a cumulative environmental impact statement or a generic environmental impact statement, because all of those things would be addressed in it. The endpoint would be addressed in it. And I think that's a great, this is something that when you send your comments to the Public Service Commission, ask for it. Say, we want to know what's going to happen, because believe it or not, 20 years goes by pretty fast.
Do we have an idea?
Let me just add one thing quickly to Bob's comments, to the response to the lady's question back there. I did invite the senator and the congressman and the congresswoman to this event. Now, listen, I know they've just got done with the budget. I understand that. So just want you to know that municipal electeds from the state and from the local level were invited. There are some here, there's some not here, but don't misunderstand me. These folks, the congressman, the congresswoman, and the senator, they've been up to their necks with the budget. But certainly, as Bob said, address it on the white paper, contact FERC, but there's no reason why you shouldn't contact the state elected officials as well. And I would frankly encourage you to do that, as well as our own local officials, your local officials.
Steve, do we know, have an average of how much kilowatt hours that per acre that a solar farm can generate in this area?
The rough guideline is 5 to 6 acres for 1 megawatt or 1,000 kilowatt hours, if that helps.
How many kilowatt hours is that?
A megawatt is 1,000 kilowatt hours.
But the number of hours in a day, how much kilowatt hours per year can you get out of an
Great
acre?
question. Why don't we move on to the next question? I have a slide that will answer that.
Brad? Okay.
Hi, I'm Emily Westfall. I'm an attorney in Syracuse who has fought for a lot of landowners dealing with wind turbines. And there, the producers lose their tax credits, federal and predominantly federal, if they don't meet a certain efficiency standard. And I wonder for solar whether that is built in, and if so, if it's proposed to be built in, so we know if they are not meeting certain efficiencies, then the project should be shut down. Thank you.
Looks like that's another question that we frankly can't answer. We don't know.
It may or may not be relevant, but I know that the Ivampo facility out in Nevada is at risk of losing their subsidies because they're not meeting their efficiency and power output requirements. But that's something I urge everybody, if you're concerned about that, look it up, because that's just something I remember from reading online, so don't take my word for it, look it up yourselves. I've actually promised this gentleman, and then I'll come up to this lady here.
I have two quick questions. The lawyer mentioned the lease money, but is there, like, do you get money per month out of the electric that's generated out of your money, or is the only money you get the lease money?
You can negotiate that, theoretically, or you could negotiate some power coming back to you for your property. The leases that I'm seeing do not have those provisions in them. So for the most part, the leases we're getting now are leases that are simply making a one-time-a-year payment. So if it's, let's say, $1,000 an acre, it's $1,000 per acre per year that is coming back to the landowner. But it's certainly something that can be done.
Okay, my second question is, I inherited my property, it's basically 65 acres and it's a mountain, It's not a farmland. Have you ever seen people do solar panels on somewhat of a mountainy area, or does it have to be a flat farmland?
They can be on the side of hills, true. But it depends on where your most exposure is for the sun, and that has to be studied.
I was just wanted to come back to answer somebody's question over here about what kind of production you can expect. And coming back to the day that Bob and I were at Cornell, we had maybe an inch of snow or so, and we looked the next day. All of this information you can find on NYSERDA's website. You can go in and you can graph the production of any of these solar farms. And at high noon, this thing was producing a grand total of 55 kilowatt hours. To put that in perspective, this is Cornell's very, very best day, which was in May of 2015. So it never produced any more power than it did on this day. And to show you where 55 kilowatt hours is, it's about there. So it didn't really do very much. So we're curious. We've had a very mild winter, very little snow. This is the actual production. Again, this is from the NYSERDA website, going back to when it was first commissioned back in September of 2014. You can see it was doing pretty good, but there's a little problem that any solar farm is going to have, especially up here. You notice that when you get into the cold months, you have a couple of problems. We have shorter days, the sun is down lower, and then as you look at February was very interesting. It basically produced no power.
You switched slides. Could you go back again?
Oh, I'm sorry. Basically produced no power. And you probably all know why. Remember all the snow we had in February of 2015?
Jim, the numbers on the scale's a little bit hard to read. Could you tell us what the maximum rating on that scale is, just so people can understand?
Maximum is 350,000 kilowatt hours.
Okay.
That's in DC, which it needs to be exchanged a little bit.
And what's the nameplate rating for this solar installation? What's the maximum it should be able to produce?
It's a little over 2,000 kilowatt hours.
Okay, so at this point it was producing maybe at most 15% of its nameplate rating?
Say again?
I just said to help out, I mean, those are, on the y-axis is energy, and so the
Yes.
system size is 2,000 kilowatts.
Right.
Like a base load rating, that's just energy, so it's not a, you can't, because that's not apples to apples.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, here,
Thank you.
here, this is their best day, and I think it's a little bit over 2,000, 2,067, something like that. And so its peak, it's hitting 1.8 megawatts.
In the generic leases that are out for review now, let's say they have a whole series of landowners signed up, but only a portion of them ever get a solar farm. Do they have fine print that allows them to put the power lines through on anyone else that has a lease, even if they don't build a solar farm there?
Potential, but watch out for it, but not this.
Scott says to watch out for it, but he has not seen that as yet.
Not if you're not going to get into the...
And is the kilovolt capacity for the connecting power lines 115 kilovolts to lead to the nearest existing 115 kilovolt?
No.
A real simple rule of thumb is most of the time they want to be near a substation or they want to be on a distribution line. And the distribution line, they're all different sizes, so they have to work out with the utility to find out what kind of available capacity might be there. So there's lots of different issues that they're looking at.
I have a question. If a non-working farm, which doesn't have all the advantages that have been mentioned, ag district and credits and all that bit, were to be, or attempted to be sold or subdivided, have studies been done as to how difficult it is or easy to market such properties that have as part of them an existing solar panel grouping? Nowhere in this presentation have I come across one other idea that I find important, but I don't find it here, and that is the word conservation. We talk about demand, 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 and supply, supply, supply. Is there any real thought being put forth by some of the committees that you people have been mentioning for some sort of conservation so that this isn't going to be terribly, terribly expensive for all of us, because this is not cheap to develop? Sir?
Thank you.
Well, of course, we've been working at conservation since the 70s. Remember the gas lines and all of that? We've been working hard. People have been putting insulation in their homes and trying to seal up all the cracks and so forth. That's been going on for a long time, but I can tell you that built into the PSC white paper is a little comment about, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's a 23% reduction in BTUs that are used for, say, heating buildings and so forth. They don't say how they're going to do that, but I'll tell you, that's an enormous conservation measure. So I'm going to be very interested to see what the PSC has to say about that. So yes, conservation is definitely part of the plan.
Is NICEAG going to be forced to pay above market rates for these solar farm generated kilowatt hours? Or are you going to get market rate, which is 4 cents?
With the SRECs, that's on top of the cost of the electricity. So you got two things. They've been just paying for the electricity at wholesale price. These SRECs are completely new costs. So they're going to have to, all of the utilities, not just NICEAG, but all of them are going to have to get into this in order to meet the mandates. Now, at first, and these SRECs can be a lot of money. I showed you in New Jersey, at one point they were paying $680 for a megawatt. Well, even if you use, let's say, bear with me with the numbers, but let's say if you're using 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour for the wholesale price, that's $75 for a megawatt. They had to pay $680 for the same megawatt in order to get their SREC. So you got the $75 plus the $680, and all this stuff is being flowed through to the end customer. You're looking at them. Now, the thing is so the solar power, the way it's set up with the SRECs, it's gradually going to phase out. But it's going to be expensive, but the thing that's saving us is that solar is such a small part of our electric generation, at least now, that we're probably not going to notice it that much. So it's expensive, but it's a small part of what we're obtaining right now. That's going to change over time, but at the same time, the value of the SRECs should come down as more and more solar panels come up, if you follow that. It's a little confusing.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our presenters. We hope you learned something.